Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to this first edition of the afkarDebates. I'm Emmanuel Cohen-Hadria from the IOMED, the European Institute of the Mediterranean in Barcelona. The first edition of the afkarDebates today will actually be a cycle of 3 webinars on the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza. And we are starting today with a conversation on the global ramifications, the global implications of the conflict. The second webinar will be on Monday next week at 12 o'clock. So you can already register for that event. That one will be on the regional, meaning the Middle East, North Africa dimension of the conflict with, in particular, Maha Yahya and Maria Luisa Fantapié as speakers. So with this, actually, Afkar is no longer only a magazine that we release with pride from the IOMED on a regular basis, but it also becomes a new format to reach out to our audience in a different way, with the objective to provide a platform to exchange analyses, ideas on what's going on in the Mediterranean. To walk us through these global ramifications of the Israel-Gaza conflict today and make sense of it, I'm very fortunate to have 3 fantastic experts with us today. So thank you very much for your time, for your availability to be with us today. Hélène Leibson, you are the director of the International Security Program at George Mason University. Thank you for making it. Fonte Akum, you're the executive director of the Pretoria-based Institute for Security Studies. Thank you very much indeed. And Julia Barnes, geographically less remote, closer to us. You're the director of the MENA program of the European Council for Foreign Relations. Okay, so let's start. I think we together we need to be humble in our analysis. We need to acknowledge that the conflict is still ongoing, and it would be, of course, too soon to come up with final assessments, but I think we can try to contribute a bit to make sense of, I think, a very striking feature, which is how, with the Hamas attack on the 7th of October and then the military operation from Israel in Gaza, we moved pretty suddenly from a situation where many were arguing that the Palestinian issue had lost any sort of global relevance to a situation where today some say that the current situation around Gaza is a game changer, is a watershed moment for the global order. And indeed, I think we would agree that already we have some indicators that let's say the butterfly effect has already started operating. We have governments, populations mobilized around this conflict around the globe. We have a conflict that has the potential to contribute to accelerating trends, shifting alliances, geopolitical trends. We also have potentially wide-ranging economic consequences. And here I'm referring to the warning that the World Bank issued about 2 weeks ago on the possible impact of the conflict. And then, of course, fourth, we have the wide-ranging domestic consequences in a number of countries around the globe, with possibly that conflict that is likely to be part of the electoral debates in a number of countries in 2024. So with that, let's move on out with our conversation. If everyone agrees, let's start with the basics, and the basics being how the conflict has actually been received and how it is being handled by different countries globally, and what has shaped these reactions. Hélène, do you mind if we start with you? It would be fantastic if you could walk us through the US response to the conflict. I think there is the tendency to see the US line as very monolithic, which I'm not sure it is. So maybe you will help us understand what the terms of the debate in Washington are today, and what is also the likely domestic impact of the conflict. So, Hélène, with this, the floor is yours, and thanks again to everyone.
Thank you, Emmanuel. It's really a pleasure, even though it's a very disturbing topic. to be back with Ahmed colleagues. So I think the United States is an outlier of world powers with respect to this conflict, because we are virtually a player in this conflict without being a combatant. We were not directly involved in the outbreak of violence, but our response to Israel and our responsibility diplomatically to try to shift the conflict in a less violent direction seems to be very much on the US's shoulders. And as you said, it's both a simplification and a deep truth to say that structurally the United States is pro-Israel. Structurally, the United States, and this is bipartisan, believes that the US has an enduring commitment to the security of Israel. So the way in which Hamas attacked Israel only revalidated that Israel is somehow vulnerable, that Israel requires this deep partnership with the United States. But at the same time, we see that Israel-Palestine, there were under the surface shifts in American views on Israel-Palestine that had been slowly building up over time. And this crisis has exposed them very sharply. So we knew always that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party was more neutral or pro-Palestinian in some ways. That had not translated directly into pressure on US policy, because since the end of the Clinton administration, we basically haven't tried very hard to push for the two-state solution and conduct kind of assertive diplomacy. Little efforts during Obama and Bush, but really since 2000 and the failure of the Camp David process, the United States has lowered its expectations that it can be the midwife of the two-state solution. So we have a domestic dimension to this conflict and a societal dimension. So the outbreak of deep, deep concern about both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is really now engaging our law enforcement community, our intelligence community. There is a societal dimension to this. I'm at a university. Universities are struggling across the country to figure out what is the right way to allow students to express very diverse views on this conflict without resorting to, crossing the line of hate speech or violence. So having said that, I would say that President Biden's approach to provide support to Israel is not questioned at the political level. I don't think that there's a deep controversy compared to, for example, aid to Ukraine, where we do have the Republican Party sort of drifting away from the commitment to keep up support for Ukraine. But let me just say that strategically, the most important thing for the national security community in the US is to prevent this war from widening into a regional war and or the showdown between the United States and Iran that has always been in our peripheral vision. I think that is, maybe we want to come back to that topic later, but whether this could become the wider US-Iran conflict is something that people are very worried about.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for this first keys to understand where the US is coming from. Fonte, will you forgive me if I add my name to those who say that they do not like the term of the global south, but who use it anyway? Maybe with you, I'd like you to help us understand how diverse the reactions have been from the global south, how predictable they were, because to a large extent, many of those reactions were predictable. If you looked at October the 7th relations of a number of countries with Israel. Let's take, for example, if you agree, the very country where you're based in. I understand that there have been new developments over the last week, but also India, to illustrate another position, and also some of the Latin American countries. Is that fine for you, Fonte? The floor is yours.
Sure. I would hark back to your call for humility, which you started with, and start by saying that it would be very difficult to actually encapsulate the diverse feeling in this amorphous entity that's the global south. However, then a few things to look at. The first is sitting in South Africa. The question about global governance has been front and center for about the past 4 years, around the COVID-19 pandemic, around issues of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now the situation in Gaza. So there's a long arc, in fact, of interrogating the representativeness, the equity of global governance, and the ability of the current global system to effectively address the transcendental challenges that we face or that face our common humanity. That said, the South African foreign minister basically published a piece in the Sunday Times, and the title of this piece is "Arrest Netanyahu and Halt Genocide in Gaza." So this is the reflection from the foreign minister in her op-ed, which speaks to some of the humanitarian dimensions of the current crisis in Gaza. However, if you look to the vote at the United Nations General Assembly on the non-binding resolution for humanitarian access, Africa remains a continent fairly divided, with some countries voting in favor, but quite a few abstentions as well. So, and a few equally voting against. Normally, the voting patterns of African countries at the United Nations General Assembly is a fair indicator of the differences that are driving these different countries. From an Egyptian perspective, you would understand that its proximity to Gaza actually makes it really preoccupied with the humanitarian dimensions of the crisis, but also to the potential flow of fighters and weapons into its territory, thereby posing an existential threat to the Egyptian government. However, from a more distant perspective in South Africa has always viewed the situation in between Israel and Palestine through the prism of its own historical lenses. So the prism of apartheid, as it's been described out here, and it has taken a pro-Palestinian view on most of these issues. However, stepping back to the question about global governance, three issues are important. The first is the question about the use of power in response to terrorist incidents. Because the situation, the attack on Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October has to be condemned. At the same time, there is supposed to be a good interrogation of the intelligence lapses just as before 9/11 in the US and before 7th October that led to this situation. The second is the interrogation of the response, early response to the attack while it was ongoing. And the third is the more calculated strategic response to try to deter future terrorist attacks. Now, those three dimensions would have to be looked at if we as a global community are going to address the question of terrorism, which does not end in Israel, but which equally mutates in the form of violent extremism in many spaces across the continent, and which is leading to quite a bit of governance challenges from across the Sahelian belt, and continues to pose a challenge in Somalia as well. The third issue I'd like to put on the table is the issue of diplomacy. You would remember that Israel got kicked out of the AU Heads of State Summit, thereby with its status, observer status suspended in February this year. This was basically, and so Israel's current actions put into question 20 years invested of Israeli diplomacy on the African continent, which has led to the establishment of 12 diplomatic representations as opposed to 26 by the Palestinian Authority. So this is the complex frame within which these two entities are engaging on the continent. And there are lots of questions about the extent to which Israel's response to Hamas's attack actually imperils the Abraham Accords as well. So these are fundamental and very important questions. Finally, I would like to end on the question of prioritization in the global space. Sitting from in South Africa, there are certain priorities that preoccupy the African Union at the moment, but also South Africa. The question of Sudan is crucial. And the crisis in Gaza basically sucks up all international attention at the moment at the expense of a credible solution to the crisis in Sudan, which is getting worse by the day. The second is the crisis in an ongoing state of crisis in Ethiopia as well. But if you look further west, the question of the role of private military entities in the Sahel, which is a preoccupation that has also contributed to the drawdown of the United Nations Stabilization Mission. And these are different dynamics which are all plugged into a global governance system, which is reaching sort of a reset point and where we need to think about what happens next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fontaine. It's great you brought in the issue of Sudan. And I think in the second part of our conversation, we indeed want to see how various crises, as you argued, how various crises are actually connected and may actually relate one to another. I think it's quite interesting to see how both you, Fontaine and Hélène, you frame the response to my question on help us make sense of the reaction of different countries. Hélène, you really focused on the immediate concern of the US to tackle very urgent issues, which was making sure that Israel had actually the resources to get protected, and Fontaine, on the other hand, framed it in a much broader way with the reactions from a number of countries from the global south being also shaped by broader concerns which go way beyond these very conflicts. So I think that's already telling, and will be interesting to get back to this later on in our discussion. For now, let us continue this round of analysis of immediate reactions with you, Julian. Can we turn to you to Russia, China, and Iran? Can you tell us with how they reacted, how this conflict plays also with the broader narrative of these countries in a global sense also? Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thanks for having me. You bring up a group of countries that I think almost sit between the two frames that you just laid out there. I think Iran, on the one hand, a bit like the US, is very much concerned with the immediate political and security ramifications for its own situation as a result of this conflict. Iran, in a sense, is a party to the conflict. It's been backing Hamas actively. It's a strong supporter of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which risks being drawn into the conflict. And it's sitting there thinking about the potential of a potential outcome that draws it into direct conflict with the US. So I think for Tehran, like for Washington, D.C., they are thinking day to day. They see this as, or they saw this as an opportunity to send a message to Israel, to weaken their sense of strength and to impose a sense of vulnerability on them. They're using Hezbollah to increase that messaging. At the same time, they're like the US, walking a very delicate line and trying to avoid being drawn into, I think, wider escalation. The US has been looking to support the Israelis unconditionally, but has also been trying to send a message that they don't want to open up a broader regional war. And I think Iran, it's a similar message. They want to send a message to Israel that actually they have options, that Israel should not believe that it has a free hand against either the Palestinians or broader kind of Iranian-backed groups in the region. But they are trying not to go so far as to escalate the situation to a degree to which they get drawn into an open war in which Hezbollah could be really seriously hit, in which Iran might directly, or the Israelis might directly target Iran. So that's Iran on the one hand. I think when it comes to China and Russia, that plays much more into the questions that Fontaine raised. I mean, they are thinking about this conflict very much in terms of how they can strengthen their own positions within the global governance question, global governance conversation. And I think that it's been quite notable that both China and Russia have by and large come down in support of the Palestinians here. They've been unprepared to give the Israelis full backing here in a way that has actually really caused a severe downgrading of relations between Israel and Russia, and Israel and China. But for both the Beijing and Moscow, they see this as an opportunity to try and push back against Western narratives that they are the ones that are trying to unravel the international order, that Ukraine is a symbol of Russian aggression. They're actually now turning that on its head and saying, well, look, here you have the West and Israel throwing the global rules-based order out of the window, engaging in violations of international law. And we, as Russia and China, are the ones that are aligning ourselves with the right of kind of principles of international law. And of course, you know, for those looking at it from the outside, there are a huge number of contradictions there. And you look at what's happening across Asia and Ukraine, and obviously this conversation, I think, doesn't necessarily stand on a solid footing. But given what Fonte mentioned about the kind of concerns about global governance, given the kind of wider global issues that are consuming everyone's attention, I think this is a way for both Moscow and Beijing to point the finger at the West and to discredit their legitimacy to a certain extent, and to if not to come out in a kind of higher place in terms of international law and moral standing, to at least muddy the water enough to delegitimize the West's argument towards them in places like Ukraine and Asia. I would just end by saying that you know there are a couple of other interesting things. One is obviously with China. We've had a lot of talk about how China is entering the Middle East, that China is a significant player in the Middle East these days. What we actually see in the Israeli-Gaza conflict is that China is not a player. You know, China has not been able to play a meaningful role there. It's made statements, it's made comments, but it hasn't been able to insert itself into the mix. And that really kind of, I think, points to the fact that China still remains far off from being a consequential regional actor. The second point is, I think that it's interesting to note that on Russia, Russia for a long time has tried to play a very interesting balancing act between all regional players. The Syrian regime, the Israelis, the Iranians, talking to everyone, navigating between them, positioning itself as a facilitator and as a mediator to a certain extent. And I think that equation is now coming unstuck. You see a gap emerging between Russia and Israel over the positioning on Gaza. And as you may have noticed, you know, there was a Hamas delegation in Moscow not so recently after the attacks. And so what you see is Russia aligning more firmly with the Russians, with the Syrian regime, with the Iranian axis across the region, and breaking with its ability to kind of hold to that mediating role. And I think that will have broader implications. Two examples of how that could play out. There have been some reports, I think the Wall Street Journal noted this, that the Wagner group might provide anti-missile weaponry to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there has also been news that the Israeli government has been more proactive in its willingness to support Ukraine on the back of Russia's positioning on Gaza. So this does play out in kind of, there are ripple effects in terms of the broader conflicts that all of them are engaged in. And you see a more kind of firmer setting in which the Russians are being drawn more firmly into the anti-Western axis and breaking with Israel, and Israel in turn may be moving more towards the West as a response to what the Russians are doing here. But let me stop there, Emmanuel. I think there's a huge number of dynamics on the table, but I would put Iran and Russia and China probably in different baskets in terms of how they're trying to respond and play off this.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for making it despite your declining voice. That's really appreciated, really. So before we, as I said, we take one step further and try and see how these reactions are telling about a more global changes in global dynamics. Let me go back a bit to the issue of the impact of the war in Gaza on domestic politics. Hélène, you described how the society is torn, not only in the US, by the way, but also in some of the European countries. Fonte, I don't know whether later on you can also tell us about any domestic considerations about the ramifications of the Gaza war in South Africa. But Hélène, can you tell us a bit about what you expect between now and the US elections? What's your how is the domestic debate likely to be shaped in the upcoming months?
Right. So a little hard to play out the implications for the elections in 2024, although people are suggesting that Michigan, which is one of the swing states that could go either Republican or Democratic, has the largest community of Arab Americans. They're Syrian, Iraqi Americans. They've been there for generations. They're not new immigrants. And they could turn against, if they don't vote Democratic, it could affect, interesting case of one state in the last election, Pennsylvania was the determinant, could be Michigan, of whether that would make a difference in a very close contest between what is presumed to be Biden and Trump going back face to face. So that's a very direct political implication. I thought it was very poignant that President Biden tried to say to the Israelis, first privately and then publicly, don't make the mistakes we made after 9/11 of being so motivated by anger and revenge that you can't think of the long term. So unfortunately, I don't think the Israelis could hear that message. I don't think they, because of the intimacy of their contact with Palestinians, it's very different than the faraway threat of al-Qaeda was in a way for the United States. But this message of restraint and whether the United States has been able to demonstrate any leverage over Israel vis-a-vis, avoiding civilian casualties, humanitarian pauses, etc. Right now, at least we're seeing some opening up here. So maybe the Israelis are reluctantly conceding that they have to adapt their military tactics. But it is an interesting question about whether the U.S. is seen as not as effective in shaping a better outcome of this conflict than we should. In the past, we were indisputably the global, diplomat, if you will. So whether the Republicans play on a perception that Biden should have done more or should have done something differently, that hasn't really surfaced yet. If we think that the tendency in the Republican Party is more isolationist, then it may be they don't want to make Israel-Gaza important in the upcoming election. They will attack Biden on other grounds, but perhaps that will not be dominant. It is an interesting predicament within the Democratic Party. As students, and I would say the society in general, and even we see this in members of Congress, that there is much more sympathy for the Palestinians. It's more even-handed sense of that both parties have legitimate grievances, and the U.S. has to be kind of ethical and moral towards both parties to this conflict. In the past, that was the Palestinians were, got less attention, if you will. So I do think within the Democratic Party, it's an interesting dilemma of how to show even-handedness or genuine concern for the Palestinians. I do think the Biden administration has already changed its public discourse, so that perhaps they've already felt where the mood of the country or the mood of their own party is. But I would worry more. I know the FBI worries about, are there Hamas cells in America? Muslim Americans being radicalized by this? So there's a lot of turbulence in the system, I would say, on how this could have domestic dynamics that have not yet revealed themselves.
Thank you, Fonte. I would expect you to tell us that somehow the debate is less central, is less pivotal in South Africa than in the US. But anything you could tell us on the domestic terms of the debate in South Africa?
So the domestic terms of the debate are not often too far from the global terms of the debate in South Africa. In fact, South Africa just hosted the BRICS summit a couple of months ago, which led to the expansion of the BRICS. And the idea behind the BRICS summit was, in fact, to provide an alternative pathway towards the reform of the international financial architecture. So a lot is read through the global prism at the moment in South Africa, and that speaks to the question of Gaza. It speaks to the question of global financial reform. But it also speaks to the question of double standards, which is one which has often been projected in the South African global space, South African political space. That said, the ANC has been consistent in its pro-Palestine position, and so has the EFF. You could equally find, but interestingly, on the Ukrainian question, the ANC actually sauntered a little closer to the Russian position, although they articulated a non-alignment, while parties like the DA actually were basically sovereignists and argued against the invasion. So the water is kind of muddied at the moment. A couple of months prior to the elections, by the first quarter of next year as well. And I'm not sure that it's going to be this particular conflict in Gaza is going to be a game changer in those elections. The projections, even before the crisis in Gaza, was that South Africa could be heading towards its first coalition government since 1994. Given the internal challenges on the economic front, but also in the provision of basic social services and growing inequalities, those predictions are not likely to change anytime soon.
Thank you very much for this. And then, as I said, now that we are very clear about the reactions that came up after the October 7th attack and then later on, now let's try to make sense of the ramifications in terms of the global dynamics. Turning to you, Hélène, again, when it comes to the US, I think at least there are three main issues. So I'm happy if you relate to some of them. One will be the possible impact that this is likely to have on the US role in the world. We also the leaked US diplomatic cable a few days ago from the Oman embassy, warning that Biden's support for Israeli military campaign is losing the US Arab publics for a generation. The second would be how the conflict is straining US resources, maybe preventing the US from dedicating enough attention to other theaters. Russia may be expecting that this is likely to weaken US position over Ukraine. China may be at ease with this position of observing US getting consumed with Ukraine, with Gaza, while China itself does not face any direct challenge of this scale. And then the third effect would be indeed how, and then I think you referred to this already, Hélène, is how the US forces around the world become targets for attacks in Iraq or Syria, for instance. So maybe if you want to have some comments to some of these issues, please go ahead.
Good. So thank you. So I think, President Biden is crystal clear about America's role in the world. He is still a very passionate defender of the liberal order. He is a passionate believer in alliances and partnerships. He thinks the United States has a much broader and more effective, connection to other like-minded countries than the two rivals, Russia and China, do. So if Biden were to be reelected, if we try to go out, 1 to 5 years, he would still be a great defender and activist on demonstrating American leadership in responding to crises wherever they may be. If Trump is reelected, he was a deep skeptic about alliances. He wanted to be much more kind of personalized, his trust in strongmen, et cetera. So all bets are off if the pendulum swings back again. But on Arab publics, it's not just Oman. My understanding is the State Department, all of the embassies in the region are reporting considerable anger towards the United States' embrace of Israel, a deep worry that Americans could be targeted in countries where the public distress is very high. I'm going to be going to Morocco this week, and I'll be very curious to see what the mood is there, because that's one of the countries that was an Abraham Accords signatory and has a deeper connection to Israel historically. But I think we have to put in perspective the numbers of whether the Arabs public see a favorable view of the United States are in the single digits. They've never been super high. Okay, so maybe it's dropped from I don't know, the 40s to the teens or below. And maybe it's temporary, but it is deeply worrisome. I mean, I think that we have well understood after the Arab Spring, there was a little bit of a contraction of American cultural presence, foreign aid presence in countries that did not, go all the way through the Arab Spring to a more open and representative system. So the Arab public thing is absolutely a true reality, and I'm not sure that there's a significant policy response to it. On straining resources, clearly there's a competition between money for Israel and money for Ukraine right now. It's playing out very vividly. And the Democratic Party says we can do both. The Republican Party says we have to make choices. I mean, I'm grossly simplifying, but that it's a little bit come down to that. And the Asians, I'm sure, are worried. I mean, look at how our preoccupation with, China, Taiwan, and building up Korea and Japan, consolidating our alliance relationships in East Asia has fallen off of the headlines. But just because it's not on the front page of the news doesn't mean it's not still happening. So I do think that the Middle East it is curious that it's Hamas that was the agent of pulling the US back into the Middle East. But there is a sort of, again, very superficial perception that, the US thought they were going to be able to downgrade their engagement in the Middle East in favor of Asia, and now obviously that's not happening. So it's a messy picture. I still believe that the internationalist impulse in our government says we can do more than one thing. We are a global actor, but right now we're in that acute phase of crisis management, and certainly Israel is crowding out other short-term priorities. There is a mindset that all the attention of the president gets sucked into this one issue where his personal engagement is absolutely critical. So, yes, in the short run, it's reallocating the time on the president's schedule, but in the long term, I don't think that we should worry that it will have dramatic impact other than this problem of Ukraine and the Republican Party sort of starting to say, we've got to, scale back our engagement there. So that's the Israel-Ukraine competition for money is an immediate story, but in the long run, I don't think that we should worry too much about resources and the US ability to still focus on Asia while we are working on other problems. I think that catches your concerns. Now, military deployments, we haven't yet mentioned 2 aircraft carriers in the Eastern Med. That's no small matter. And if they are there to deter Iran and its partners, it's not working because there's a real uptick in small attacks on Americans in Iraq, in the base that we have in eastern Syria. So if we thought that plussing up of military presence was going to be both reassuring to our friends, maybe that is true, but a negative signal to our adversaries, the evidence is to the contrary so far.
Thank you very much indeed. Julia, let me rush a question that I had foreseen for a bit later, but a question actually from one of our viewers encourages me to do so now. It's about the implications on Europe and the EU. For once, from the IMED, we have chosen not to start with this upfront, but to get to this a bit later in the conversation. But maybe we all know more or less about, again, different reactions from different member states. Let's try to focus rather on the likely effect that this conflict may have on EU's relations with its partners in the Middle East and North Africa. The EU did not need to wait for this crisis to be a bit in an introspective mode when it comes to its relations with this region. But how, what's the cumulative effect of this conflict on that sort of relations? Julian?
Thank you, Emmanuel. And I mean, as with the US, I think the kind of strong support for Israel has certainly hit Europeans hard in terms of popular sentiment across the Arab world. I mean, we haven't talked much about the kind of the fierce, strong popular response we've seen across the Middle East and North Africa behind the Palestinians, and the kind of strong sense of outrage that the West at large, the US and Europeans, have been seen to line up politically and militarily behind Israel. Regional governments have been put on the back foot by this. They've been forced to respond to that pressure on their own government lines. And I think the kind of the regional perception, particularly amongst the kind of broader population, is one of severe anger towards Europeans. I was speaking to someone last week who was talking to me about the number of voices from civil society who particularly feel very kind of betrayed by the West on this. The civil society that's traditionally looked to the West for support, for guidance, for leadership on so many issues related to kind of the liberal global world order, and who suddenly find themselves now feeling very let down by what Europe is positioning on this conflict. And look, I think no one is really naive enough to really think that kind of this narrative of a global rules order really kind of held much water. I mean, everyone knew that it was slightly fictitious to begin with, and it had lots of holes, but I think this has clearly given regional governments and regional populations an opportunity to really kind of throw that back in the face of Europeans and the US. And that is, going back to our first kind of intervention, I think that's something that the Russians and the Chinese are clearly trying to exploit here. This is an opportunity for them to say, look, this is how the world works. And in reality, when the West wants something, it doesn't necessarily align itself with international law on that basis. So I think Europe will have a lot of work to do in the period ahead. I mean, there is a need to address the fact that the kind of senior Europeans have not been willing to call for the full kind of implementation of international humanitarian law, or have not been willing to support humanitarian ceasefires in a meaningful way. This has all resonated very loudly across the Middle East. Europe was not in a good position to start with. Obviously, much of the region does look to the US as a major regional actor. They don't look to the Europeans. The Europeans have had a weak hand for a long time, and in many sense, they've been very transactional and realpolitik in their approach anyhow. So one shouldn't necessarily be surprised by how this is playing out in terms of regional sentiments. But that element has been reinforced. I'd say a couple of other things in terms of the European response. You, Emmanuel, did mention internal European divisions. I think that has been very weakening for Europe's sense of itself in this kind of post-Ukraine global order. We've seen very visible, very vocal divisions between different parts of the EU. We've seen three different voting blocks in UN resolutions. There have been strong efforts and failures by the European Council to put out various statements on issues related to the conflict. So obviously that weakened Europe both internally, but also its sense of the external. I would also note European domestic politics. This is an issue that plays out very acutely in some European states. You look at somewhere like France, with a strong kind of Jewish population and a strong Muslim population. That has been quite impacted by all of this. In Germany, where you have the historic legacy of the Holocaust, and there's been a very strong support for Israel, you've seen kind of quite active and kind of forceful pushback on the streets. So this is not just something about European external relations. This is something that will play out in internal European politics, and we could see kind of having a big impact on the European elections we have next year. And then finally, just one last point on Europe. We were just hearing about the US capacity or not to kind of dedicate resources to multiple global challenges. And I think there is a degree of European concern about what this will mean for Ukraine. Ukraine does remain the kind of European priority number one. But I'm not sure that all Europeans are as confident as others that the US does have the resources to maintain a full focus and support for Ukraine as it's being dragged into deploying kind of naval carrier fleets into the Eastern Mediterranean at a time, frankly, when there is an increasing sense that the US is growing slightly kind of wary of what happens next in Ukraine and maybe more open to some kind of negotiating process. So that is on the mind of Europeans, and there's a big effort to try and say, look, we will remain focused on Ukraine as everything else is going on globally. But I think, you know, that is a question to bear in mind as things move forward. What does this mean for kind of Europe's posture more globally and towards Ukraine as some of the global focus get sucked into the Middle East?
Thank you, Julian. And I will turn to Fonte before that, just to tell you that we have about 10-15 minutes left. So I would also encourage all our viewers to, you know, formulate whatever comments, questions you may want to raise. Fonte, maybe back to what I was saying at the beginning about the potential of this conflict to accelerate or amplify global trends. You know, as much as the World Bank is worried about the dual shock coming from the combined effects of the Ukraine and the crisis in the Middle East on commodities markets, do you see that a broader combined effect of these two is widening the gap between the West and the global South? To me, this is to a large extent a constructive narrative, a self-fulfilling prophecy, whatever you want to name it, that ignores the complexity of the facts, including, as we just described today, the fact that everyone in the West is not supporting Israel unconditionally, neither street nor governments. But the fact is that narratives or perceptions have become as important as realities, haven't they? So again, my question is on from where you are, what can you tell us about your perception about the potential of this conflict to widen the perception of this gap? Okay.
So interestingly, when we speak about narratives, it becomes important as well to speak about the technologies, some of which are driving the narratives we are seeing, and the pervasive influence of disinformation, misinformation, and all sorts of different AI-generated influences on political systems, right? Because it's impossible to separate from that technological reality. The fact of the matter is, if you look to the Central African Republic all the way to the Sahel, from on the African continent, Russia has actually invested very little for optimal return on investment in terms of the kinds of political shifts that we are seeing and challenging the French stranglehold on some of these former French colonies, right? That's a first observation. The second is the tendency for a lot of Western European countries to actually align with France on many issues relating to Africa, when in fact strategic autonomy could be more relevant today in separating a French historical and colonial interest from other European interests on the continent. The third issue that you need to look at is one that I raised before. The global system that we have today was born in 1945, right? After the Second World War. And the question is the current global system actually fit for purpose? The gridlock that we are seeing at the United Nations Security Council is not generally reflected in the voting patterns at the United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly seems to vote on the core and moral principles that the United Nations was founded on, while the United Nations Security Council members generally increasingly tend to vote in oppositional patterns, with the P2 on one side and the P3 on the other, regardless of what the question is. And in this kind of context, for African countries and the African Union, the first preoccupation is understanding exactly what African agency means in the current global context. Africa, with 54 countries which are members of the United Nations Security Council, is actually the biggest voting bloc within the UN General Assembly at the moment. Sorry, within the UN General Assembly is the biggest voting bloc. What does that mean, in fact, in defining global governance? The second preoccupation is, if you look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union, it actually is very strong on principles of sovereignty, on issues of subsidiarity, but also on questions of collective action in addressing serious problems. While challenges might exist in operationalizing these issues, normatively, they actually matter. And could the global system actually draw from some of these normative principles to actually overcome some of the challenges we are seeing at the moment? The third preoccupation is the consistent use of military power to advance foreign policy. When over the past 2 decades, from Iraq to Afghanistan, and we are seeing the same mistake being made in Ukraine, it's almost a misnomer to try to use military power to try to either repress or expand empire. And if we come to the conclusion that collective action is more relevant than singular pursuit of foreign policy through military might, then we might be moving in a different direction, where smart power becomes more relevant in global politics than hard power. So these are some of the preoccupations, in fact, which basically put a lot of the countries in the global south, and I'll say in Africa, on a path towards a new form of non-alignment, where they want to be able to make choices on their partnerships, while leveraging this diversity to engage with China, for example, on infrastructure, but to engage with the US on education and energy, for example. So they want to be able to leverage this diversity of offers on the global scale to be able to advance towards the full achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we will miss, in fact, by a wide margin by 2030. So these are the preoccupations, right? And so any pursuit of hegemony becomes contested in the spaces in which we sit. Any form of global dominance becomes contested, and there is more of a turn towards the appreciation of the role of the rise of middle powers like Turkey and the role that they're playing on the continent, and the capacity of African states to work with such middle powers to address the problems which preoccupy them. One of the biggest challenges facing the emerging economies on the continent at the moment is the debt issue. So we might look at Gaza, we might look at Ukraine, we might talk about food security and insecurity, but African governments are facing difficult choices on whether to service debt or to actually address the provision of social services in their countries. And these are choices, in fact, which are increasingly undermining respect for democratic norms as the basic form of governance on the continent. So if we're going to move forward, while these global challenges affect Africa, Africa's preoccupation with debt servicing, with industrialization, and with energy would need to be taken seriously as well.
Thank you so much, Fonte, for that insight. You know, if we are discussing the global implications of the war, of the conflict in the Middle East, there is maybe one issue that we haven't tackled that much so far, which is the impact of the conflict on the global ranking of Israel. And the reason I'm putting that in now is because we have a question from one of our viewers, and I will read it as it is here, inviting some of you maybe to bring their analysis on the table. Any comment from the speakers on the civilian casualties from the Gaza operation of the Israeli army and its implications? One, on international law prosecutions against the state of Israel. Two, long-term sustainable security of the state of Israel. And three, public diplomacy of Israel, which is again the global ranking of Israel. Does anyone want to come in?
Emmanuel, I'll take a crack at a couple of those dimensions. So it's not the first time that Israel is accused by the international community of excessive force, of not being attentive enough to the, just war principles, etc. I think And I think that we have been trying our best, in private and now or in public, to make the Israelis more attentive and sensitive to this. I think they are in a state of such, acute, they're in overdrive to try to restore the sense that they can manage their own security, and they are making these, very aggressive moves. I think when the dust settles, we may have a slightly more nuanced view of whether these hospitals were legitimate targets, what the state of these tunnels were, whether, any of this, what will people be able to think analytically about what some of the hard choices in the military tactics were. But I certainly don't disagree with the principle that the international perception is that Israel has been insensitive, inattentive to civilian casualties. But I want to make a slightly different point, which is that on the one hand, October 7th is a catastrophic failure of the Israeli national security system. Okay, it's the political leadership, the intelligence, the national security preparations. They were spending too much time using the IDF to protect settlers in the West Bank, and they took their eye off the ball of what was happening in Gaza. They thought Gaza was contained, if you will. Catastrophic failure, worse than the October 73 war, possibly. At the same time, the mobilization of Israeli civil society that was protesting every day, every week, against Bibi Netanyahu's judicial reforms, that network of people turned out to be amazingly important in the first days after October 7th. I've heard that there were sort of 3 large groups where, on WhatsApp and various channels, people were finding each other, and civil society responded in ways that the state could not. They went down to these kibbutzim on the border of Gaza. They provided, basic support to the soldiers that were being deployed. And there's a very paradoxical mood in Israel that civil society is still more resilient, more honorable, more decent, that Israel hasn't completely lost touch with some of its core attributes as a society. And also, when the dust settles, you can't take away the human capital of Israel, the technology advancements, et cetera. So for sure, they will suffer a dip in democracy ratings in terms of human rights, et cetera. But the other big debate that's going on is, can they find a way in this state of national emergency to do even more than they've already done in terms of national unity government? Can you remove a deeply, controversial prime minister during this crisis, even without having to hold national elections? So there's a lot going on that Israel will, over time, I think Israel will find that there's still some societal resilience, even if the macro indicators at the level of the national government have really taken a hit, a very bad hit.
Emmanuel, if you'll allow me to add one word on that, I mean, I would say just a couple of things. I think, the global South, and whatever that means, was already very much pro-Palestinian before October 7th and everything that has unfolded since then. I think that has very much been reinforced by development since then. And I think that's a function of both the military operation, but also how the likes of China and Russia and others are kind of exploiting this to make it a campaign to attack the West. And I think, whatever does happen or emerge factually on the other side, I think, it's perceptions that shape kind of reality here. And I think Israel is going to find itself in a much tougher and more isolated position than perhaps it has for a long, long time. And I would just link that to a second question. I think, there are obviously there's obviously lots of internal questions in Israel about the nature of the government and how you if and whether and how you oust Netanyahu. But there is very little serious thinking or conversations happening on how you reach a political settlement with the Palestinians. And I think that is a huge issue here. There is clearly no end game in sight. The Netanyahu government, which has been more right-wing than any government for a long time, has made clear that it has no appetite whatsoever for a political solution with the Palestinians. And of course, Hamas is very much a product of that in terms of Netanyahu trying to grow them up at the expense of the PA. And you don't really hear voices within Israel today, on the back of these horrific terror attacks, obviously, talking about the need for a political outcome here. And I think, a lot of the global South will say, well, there is a context here. There's a historical context, and they link it to colonialism and the kind of injustice of occupation. And I think, obviously, kind of Guterres was strongly attacked by Israel when he talked about that historical context. And I think if there is an unwillingness by Israel to also respond now in terms of a political outcome, in terms of a political pathway that acknowledges some of the broader context here, I think it will also struggle with the kind of broader international context, the global South. And I think that is one of the big dilemmas, and that's one of the big challenges for the US and the Europeans, is to press Israel not just to say, okay, we back you in terms of self-defense, but how can we make sustainable security for you? How can we deliver an outcome that actually delivers the kind of political necessities for both Israelis and Palestinians to prevent the kind of ongoing wars and horrors that we've seen for so long now?
Thank you very much indeed. With this, I think we'll need to close. I would like to close with a very sincere thanks to our, unless Fonte, we have a few minutes. If you want to comment on this, of course, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, the end game is crucial here. How these all end would basically determine the pathway to Israel regaining some degree of credibility within the global system after. If the end game is the occupation of Gaza, then it's going to be really challenging, right, to see a pathway for Israel. If the end game is basically stamping out Hamas, however possible that is, and withdrawing to Israel's border limits as they are at the moment, then there is a pathway to some kind of political solution. Bibi is not going to govern Israel forever either. So Israel has to look to its options beyond Bibi once the time comes as well. And the two-state solution seems like the most credible outcome. A move from the Merkavas in Gaza at the moment to the peace table would be a way in which to move this from the battlefield to the peace table and find a solution going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Fonte. Let me then indeed close with thanks and with two announcements. My thanks to the speakers for fascinating insights. Really, I really enjoyed. I hope that my second thanks to our viewers. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. My two announcements would be one, that please do not hesitate to share this video with some of your friends or contacts, because it will be made available on the YouTube channel of the IOMED indeed. And the second announcement is that next week you are most welcome to join the second webinar of this cycle. As you may have seen from today's session, we avoided getting into many things about the MENA, the Middle East, North Africa ramifications, because we will do this on Monday next week with Maha, Yahya, and Maria Luisa Fantapie. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day, Hélène, or have a nice evening, everyone.